On this episode of China Unscripted, how repression feeds off technology, what the UN can actually do about China, and how to keep up the fight for human rights. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Zhang.
And I'm Matt Ganesta.
And joining us today is award-winning human rights lawyer David Matas. David, thank you for joining us again.
Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. I want to congratulate you for recently winning the Global Humanitarian Leader of the Year award for your work exposing organ harvesting in China. That's great news.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. And that was from the group Canadians in Support of Refugees in Dire Need. I assume they're not talking about Americans.
Well, I'll leave that for you to decide.
Okay. Very politic. Well, so obviously you've been talking, we know you on this show as the man who has been researching organ harvesting in China. But more recently, you've been very outspoken about the coronavirus and how the world needs to respond in the face of it. So what are some of the ways you think the world and governments around the world should respond to the coronavirus pandemic?
The coronavirus, it presents a new problem, but it also impacts on old problems, and in some cases exacerbates them. I think we see a lot of bigotry that's associated with the coronavirus, and a lot of that bigotry is not new, but it just develops a new vocabulary and a new form because of the coronavirus. And so I think we have to respond to the new forms the old bigotry takes. That's one facet. Another facet of the coronavirus is, of course, that there's a lot more a shutdown, a lot less in-person contact, a lot more electronic contact. And the rise of electronic contact also imposes new problems like Zoom bombing and the increased social media hate, and the problems with social media and the internet in the terms of absence of control and as a factor for propagation of hatred is not new with COVID, but it's been exacerbated by COVID. So that as a result, we have to draw our attention or refocus or give our attention or give increased priority to the problems that the internet poses through the spying and false news and propagation of hatred that may have existed before, but assumes a new dimension with COVID. So those are a couple of things I would mention.
Yeah, and there is a lot there. Obviously, as you mentioned, the internet being a forum for people to propagate racism and whatnot. Also, we've seen how the Chinese Communist Party has used the internet to spread false information about the coronavirus pandemic, that it came from Italy or from India or from America. So yeah, it's interesting that this is sort of bringing to a head a lot of issues that were simmering under the surface but never really got the attention they deserved.
Yes, I think that's true.
In particular, it really revealed how dependent the world is on China supply chains. People seem to be surprised that all of the personal protective equipment was made in China.
Yeah, there's not only the dependence on supply chains, which is a problem for any country that doesn't produce everything internally. It's also there's misrepresentation and shoddy workmanship, which is the second problem. Third problem is, there's use of forced labor in China. There's a problem of importing goods from China, particularly from Xinjiang, where there's a good chance that forced labor is being used. There's the unreliability of the Chinese commitments. There's a politicization of Chinese commitments. There's the false information. It's a whole sequence of problems.
Well, let's jump into the forced labor a bit because we want this to be a fun podcast. Tell us a bit about what the latest we're seeing in terms of forced labor in Xinjiang and how that relates to products that are being exported.
We've got a lot of anecdotal information. We've got satellite information. And we've got some reaction by governments. There's a proposed legislation which is going through Congress right now, where the goods from Xinjiang would be presumptively presumptively produced by forced labor and therefore banned from entry, it's a rebuttable presumption, but there has to be evidence to rebut the presumption. And in Canada, actually through this group, the Canadian Support of Refugees in Dire Need, I've made a similar request to the government of Canada that they, right now, the customs tariff says no goods by forced labor, that they presumptively state that from Xinjiang it is forced labor unless there's something to rebut that presumption. They have said so far they're not going to do that. They want to take directions from global affairs, and we're still pursuing that. But I think there's a widespread appreciation that this is a real problem in Xinjiang, and the question is what to do about it.
Well, so going back to the coronavirus, my question is, we've really seen, so in your work exposing organ harvesting, a big problem has been the international medical community sort of taking China's side, being very in bed with the Chinese Communist Party. And that really came back to bite us in the coronavirus, like how we saw the World Health Organization. Wasn't there some study that if they had worked a little harder, if they got the Chinese Communist Party to actually be honest about what was happening a few weeks earlier, like 95% of this wouldn't have happened?
Yes.
Have you seen any kind of awakening in the medical community that maybe we shouldn't be trusting the Chinese Communist Party?
There is I would say, a difference. I mean, we're dealing with different components of the medical community here. With organ transplant, we were dealing with the Transplantation Society, and the transplant profession, I would say, has been split on this issue about what to deal with China, with the majority or the leadership or many of it, unfortunately, taking the side of China or saying, basically, we're not going to investigate as long as they say they're going to reform. We're happy, and that's the end of it. There is a minority that takes the opposite point of view, and I know some of these people, and so it's not a uniform problem. With the coronavirus, it's been a bit of a different issue because the World Health Organization is an intergovernmental body, and China is an important component of it. And they don't have a compliance assessment mechanism. Maybe they should, but they have a tendency not to want to step on the toes of any government, just because of the nature of what that organization is. And they certainly were much too slow to react and much too easy to take the side of China in the World Health Organization. But I'm not sure you can blame the medical profession for that. I think that's more the UN bureaucracy, where China has disproportionate influence, and within the UN system, the UN bureaucrats are very reluctant to criticize China about anything. But that strikes me as well. I mean, obviously they're both problems, but they're not exactly the same problem.
True. And this is something that comes up a lot. I mean, China sits on the UN Human Rights Council. It's insane. And I hear this a lot from people, like what can be done about China's outsized influence over the United Nations? I mean, they sit on the Security Council, so I don't know if there's anything that can be done, but it makes the UN kind of useless.
I wouldn't say completely useless. And I mean, we went through this before with the League of Nations, where there was a tendency for countries to drop out because they didn't like what was going on, and it made the League kind of useless. The UN obviously is limited, where you've got China, and I mean, it's far from the only undemocratic country that's involved.
France.
Russia's a problem, and Russia also has a veto on the Security Council, and there's many other countries that they don't present the same problem as China, but they're happy to go along with China because they support each other in terms of their non-democratic views. And there are some mechanisms that are useful within the UN, the expert mechanisms, although because they're independent from the geopolitical structure, the expert mechanisms, there's the theme mechanisms and the treaty mechanisms. China tends not to sign on the treaties or to exempt itself from anything in terms of compliance assessment, but the theme mechanisms are a lot more broad-ranging. China's tried to get involved through the Human Rights Council in deciding who would become the thematic experts, but they haven't completely distorted that system. So that system is sometimes useful. And also, I mean, you have the Universal Periodic Review, and you do have the opportunity at the Human Rights Council for all the member states of the UN to speak up, not just the members. And at the UN, you may not get the vote you want, but you can certainly say whatever you want. And nothing should prevent the democratic rights promoting countries from speaking up and saying about China the reality of China. I mean, having a forum to do that, a global forum where China is sitting and listening, albeit ignoring and insulting and attacking, is better than doing nothing. Although obviously it's not it's not ideal. And there are all some of the international mechanisms, like the International Court of Justice. It's difficult to get there because China's opted out of most of the mechanisms. But the International Criminal Court offers some prospect. I don't know if you've been following, but the prosecutor produces annual reports of communications from whomever and responses. And there has been some communications about China. China is not a party to the court treaty, but the court has a jurisdiction where a crime is committed on the territory of a state party, even if it's by a national of a non-state party. And that form of jurisdiction has been used by the court against Myanmar, which is not a state party, because the crime of deportation has occurred not only in Myanmar, the Rohingya, but in Bangladesh, where the Rohingya have been sent, and and Bangladesh is a state party. So there was a complaint against or a communication to the prosecutor about China, which said that there's been deportations of Uyghurs from Tajikistan and from Cambodia or Kampuchea to China, in which the Chinese were involved in basically in requiring or imposing this deportation. And Tajikistan and Cambodia are state parties and trying to get China prosecuted or the Chinese involved in this deportation prosecuted before the International Criminal Court. And the prosecutor said, basically, give me more detail, give me more information. So there is an attempt now to collect that information, and who knows, maybe it'll succeed. But I think each of these individual efforts are worthwhile. I also would say the United Nations is not the only multilateral body that can deal with this sort of issue. Right now, the Council of Europe has a treaty open for signature on trafficking in human organs, and it's open to any country in the world that wants to sign it. It isn't just open to members of the Council of Europe, and that's one thing that I think the United States could do, Canada could do, countries that are not members of the Council of Europe sign on to that treaty and implement that treaty, which would allow or require states to penalize complicity in Chinese organ transplant abuse and other foreign transplant abuse. There's those sorts of options.
Well, so this international law kind of fascinates me, and this ties into a lot of what you've been doing. Like, there's been more and more evidence about organ harvesting in China coming up. The China Tribunal, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that later. What can international law actually do to hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable, whether it's for organ harvesting or for making them accountable for the coronavirus pandemic?
International law is not just applied in international instances like the International Criminal Court or whatever. It is also applied in local courts through universal jurisdiction laws, through Magnitsky type listing legislation, through civil suits as well as criminal suits. I think that one thing that any country could do is apply its international law jurisdiction applied in domestic courts to deal with this sort of phenomenon, so that you could prosecute people in Canada or the UK or the US who are complicit in organ transplant abuse in China, that you could allow for civil lawsuits against people who set up the system or inflicted the system. You could name the perpetrators under the Magnitsky legislation so that they would be barred from entry, their assets would be seized. There's a wide variety of these sorts of options, which should be, in my view, both considered and implemented.
So that would also include penalties for a citizen of a country going to China to get organ transplant.
Sure. I mean, you would have to set up a system so they knew what they were doing.
Mhm.
But my own view is that the primary focus should not necessarily be the patients who may not be very well informed or thinking very clearly,
Yeah.
and are in a kind of a desperate situation. But you have to look at the people who facilitate this sort of because there's brokers, there's referring doctors. I mean, one thing that's very simple it would be simply a compulsory reporting system so that you knew who was going and who was coming back. And we don't have that. I mean, we have some voluntary reporting systems, but I'm not aware of. I mean, some countries are so small that they just know from who shows up at the hospital who's done it. But as far as I know, there's no country that has a compulsory reporting system, and it should exist.
You know, you actually made a better defense of the UN than I've heard in a long time. So this is where international organizations like the UN can come in handy by being able to be a forum where these issues can be discussed, where at least some kind of statement can be made condemning actions that then can be used by individual countries to affect law.
Yes, well, the UN is a lot better at setting standards than implementing them, and it's a lot better at articulating ideals than pointing fingers. And if you go to the UN to get them to criticize China, no matter how justifiable that criticism is, it's very difficult. But if you go to the UN and ask them to adopt a global standard of what should be done to prevent this or to do that, they're often quite prepared to do that. And the Chinese, as far as they're concerned, I mean, when it comes to human rights, this is to a certain extent good news, is that everybody accepts it. I mean, the hypocrisy is what the credit that vice gives to virtue, and China will not reject standards. They'll just say, "I agree, fine, they're perfectly all right. We just aren't violating." And so they're not an obstacle to, I would say, generally to overall acceptance of standards. They don't like reporting mechanisms. They don't like compliance mechanisms. They don't like enforcement mechanisms. But the standards themselves, they do not reject, and so it is sometimes useful to get the UN to do that.
That's a really good point, actually, that, internationally, human rights are considered important. And the Chinese Communist Party can't say, we don't care about human rights. What
Mm.
they have to do is do some kind of redefining what human rights are, that they define human rights as, oh, well, we've lifted people out of poverty, or, don't look at Xinjiang, but look at how many skyscrapers there are. And so it's an interesting way to kind of force their hand to at least adopt certain language that the international community would prefer, and in a way expose their own hypocrisy in doing it.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So this sounds like a very slow process in terms of trying to get accountability.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I've been working on human rights all my professional life, and which is relatively long now. And what I see over the course of the decades I've been working on it, that old violations disappear and new ones surface. I mean, when I started dealing in human rights, the phenomenon of Falun Gong didn't exist. The repression of Falun Gong certainly didn't exist. I mean, we see violations in Xinjiang that we used not to see, and so on. But on the other hand, some of the issues that I worked on have completely disappeared, like apartheid in South Africa. I was very involved in that, and it's completely gone. Or the problems of the Soviet Union. Well, Soviet Union disintegrated. The military dictatorship states in Latin America, they pretty well all gone as well. And so I think generally, and and frankly, I would, I hope I live to see the day where all the problems of communist China will disappear and the perpetrators are brought to justice. But I'm under no illusion that even if that all is resolved, there's going to be something else somewhere else. That the struggle against human rights violations is a never-ending struggle. It's not just slow; it's endless. Because what you're dealing with is human nature, and humans as a whole are not going to all of a sudden everywhere turn completely good. I mean, that's just not going to happen.
Well, I wonder on that note, do you have any, like, since you've been doing this so long, do you have any insight on how these human rights issues keep coming up? I go about my day and I never have the urge to, harvest somebody's organs for profit. How do how do these things keep happening?
Well, I don't think there's one genesis for every simple explanation for the sequence of human rights violations. But one thing that I have noticed, which I think is generic in nature, is the interplay between new technology and new human rights violations. That to a certain extent, we're always closing the barn door after the horses escape.
Mm.
The Because all technologies are morally neutral, and the people who develop them don't necessarily think of how they can be abused, or think as they develop them how how they can prevent their abuse. They don't even imagine the abuse. I think that Albert Einstein was very important in terms of the relationship between energy and mass, and which eventually led to the creation of the atomic bomb and then the hydrogen bomb. And he said himself, if I knew what was going to happen with what I discovered, I would have remained a watchmaker, which he was before he went into physics.
Hmm.
And you can see that with organ transplantation, the organ transplant, people who developed organ transplantation, I'm sure never imagined that political prisoners would be killed for their organs, that the technology would be used that way. You can see that with the internet, where I mean, the people who developed the internet were completely blindsided by the manipulation, the false news, the propagation of hatred, that they have generated, or that their devices have generated. And the march of technology is going to continue, and this blindsidedness, I anticipate will also continue.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. What do you think about things like Hannah Arendt's banality of evil playing a role in this?
I mean, what she was dealing with, I mean, the phrase banality of evil is that evil's very commonplace, very ordinary, unthought out, not philosophical. It's not very much in the way of ideological. I think that's partly true. It's not completely true. I mean, you can see in terms of communist ideology, some of it is quite sophisticated. That it's wrong, but it's not, I would say, dumb wrong. I mean,
Hmm.
it takes a bit of going through to get out what's wrong with it. But if you look at the sort of the frontline perpetrators, and you start interviewing them, not I've done a bit, but there's genocide scholars who've done a lot more, and they'll tell you that, I mean, sometimes, it's just their job. They haven't thought it through. They've got the most confused idea of what they're doing. And so I think it's a combination of both. They're And I think it's worth addressing both. That I think when it comes to confronting these, or if you're engaged in preventive action, you have to both get the prevention down to a very basic level, but you also have to aim at a higher level as well, because there are people who are trying to set up the platform or the justification in a very sophisticated way, and you have to address both the sophisticated and the banal.
So you mentioned you've interviewed people who have committed genocide.
Well, I wouldn't say interviewed them, but I've dealt a lot with war criminals, and I've read what they said, and I've seen what they said in courts. But the genocide scholars have interviewed them, absolutely. they would be like the frontline shooters or whatever. And yeah, I've met scholars who've done that.
So you mentioned communist ideology, and this is something I've wondered about. It certainly has a long history of failing and being pretty horrible, and yet something about that ideology seems persistent and keeps coming back. Do you have any insights on that?
Well, obviously, for the Communist Party of China, what matters to them is keeping in power, and they hang on to communism because it'd be pretty hard for the Communist Party to stay in power and denounce communism. There's a kind of self-interest at play. But there's this whole, I mean, for people, and there's also, of course, the fellow travelers, the people who feel they're going to benefit economically or their careers will advance if they somehow go along with the communist Chinese. But you did get people who are straight ideological committed, which are going back to Marx and Lenin and Trotsky and that whole ideology of anti-capitalism and oppression of the workers and this notion that Marx and Engels said, which is workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains. That sort of ideology still persists. And you see it in a lot of different ways in a lot of different writings continuously. And I mean, it feeds off to a certain extent income inequality. I mean, what you see in the United States is a good example. There's huge variations in income where the economy is growing, but the minimum wage hasn't grown. So there's these kinds of economic diversities and inequalities that attract people to the Marxist analysis. And obviously, there's a way of dealing with that, both ideologically and practically. But it's just a facet of the kind of intellectual panorama in front of us with which we have to deal.
Well, I hope this leads to something a little optimistic. But so you've been working on organ harvesting for
That's optimistic.
for a number of years. How have you seen that change? Is this going to become one of those issues that you've worked on that disappears? Is it heading in that direction, or?
Well, no, I mean, not right now. I wouldn't say it's disappearing now. In fact, it's getting worse
All
because
right.
what's happened is the repression of Falun Gong started in 1999. The large-scale sourcing from Falun Gong was a year or two later, 2000, 2001. And it was a result of the Chinese having in their jails a huge Falun Gong population. When Falun Gong was first repressed in 1999, the practitioners couldn't really understand why this was happening because it was and is a harmless set of exercises. I mean, it's like the government of India banning yoga. I mean, why would they do that? And so there was a lot of demonstrations basically saying Falun Gong is good and you just don't understand what Falun Gong is, sort of thing. These demonstrations brought out hundreds of thousands of people who were mostly all arrested. And if they didn't recant and renounce and denounce their co-practitioners, they were kept in indefinite arbitrary detention. So this became a captive organ donor pool, but it was kind of static. I mean, there were continuing arrests over the years, but not in the same huge volume that there was in the early years with the original demonstrations. And so that this captive organ bank over the years, because the numbers that being sourced were tens of thousands every year, the number eventually got depleted.
Ugh.
And so what we've seen more recently is that kind of depletion is being compensated for by Uyghurs who become a new kind of filling in the gaps in the organ forced organ donor supply chain through the depletion of the Falun Gong. This has become possible again through technology because because of the development of transplant technology, ischemic time, or the time of an organ outside the body, is greater now than it used to be. And when we started our work, China didn't have a national organ distribution system. Now they do. And so it's become a lot easier to do that. And of course, we've got a whole new victim population. There's also Tibetans and the house Christians in smaller numbers. Although I don't know if you follow this, but the Eastern Lightning or the Church of the Almighty God, they've just come up with a recent report that's been dealing with this issue as well. And I think it would be very difficult for the Chinese system to get off this because it's financing the whole health system. It's not just a moneymaker, it's an underpinning, which is part of the reason. I mean, part of the reason China got into it just was the technology was available, but it was also the reason was they'd started sourcing organs from prisoners sentenced to death, and then because of international pressure, they kind of cut down on the number of death penalty cases, and therefore had fewer death penalty organs. And they shifted from, I mean, even though they use the communist name, they don't use socialism. Practically now, it's a capitalist economy with a communist label, and they took a lot of money out of the health system as well as with a lot of other systems. And the result is that the health system basically compensated for with the shift from socialism to capitalism and withdrawal of government funds from the health system. The health system compensated for that, replaced that funding with the selling of organs.
But hold on, that can't be entirely considered capitalist because it is a state-run organ harvesting. So if the healthcare industry is being propped up by the state killing people for their organs, that isn't just a normal capitalist system.
Well, I wouldn't call the Chinese capitalist system a normal capitalist system, far from it. But it's much more, it's capitalist in the sense it's market driven. It's supply and demand sort of thing. And I mean, you could just see what happened with the head of Alibaba. He could make as much money as he wanted as long as he doesn't criticize China. As soon as he starts criticizing China, he disappears. So that's obviously not a normal capitalist system, but it's a type of capitalist system. And we do have hospitals that say, you know, we couldn't keep our doors open if we weren't selling organs, or they didn't quite put it in those words, but we couldn't keep our doors open if we didn't engage in organ transplantation. That's what they would say. So, you know, your question is this going to end? Well, I don't see an immediate dynamic that's causing it to end. In the short term, this looks to be a continuing problem.
So just a second. So that was not quite the message of hope I was hoping to get. Let me rephrase my question just a little bit. Have you seen at least the international community become more aware of the issue? A little less of, oh, that's just conspiracy theories, that's not happening. I want that message of hope.
That didn't sound very convincing.
No.
Yeah, I think this is a problem generally with international human rights violations that, and I've seen this over and over again, that it's not happening to me, it's not happening here. I don't understand what's going on there. There's a conflicting narrative, and I can't be bothered to sort it out, or I can't figure out how to sort it out. And that's not unique to organ harvesting. I would say that's across the board and across the decades for foreign human rights violation. But, you know, if you're in China and you try to combat this problem, you're going to be a part of the problem. Gao Jisheng, who is a human rights lawyer in China, he says, you become a human rights advocate, you become a human rights victim. So it's only the outsiders who can deal with it, like myself. I mean, I have no political or financial interest in China. I have no family contacts in China. I have no personal interest in China, which on one hand makes me quite free to act. But for most people, it also means, you know, why should I care? And so I think the problem is generally mobilizing people to care about these violations. There was an ancient Greek philosopher called Solon, in, you know, several centuries BC. He says, "When will we get justice? People feel injustice who are not affected as badly as those who are affected."
So that was several thousand years ago, and this is not hopeful.
Well, as I say, we're dealing with a never. I mean, I wouldn't say with Falun Gong and organ harvesting that will end at some point, but in terms of international human rights violations, the issue is not is it going to disappear. The issue is it going to get better or worse? And I would say in the organ harvesting field, at least internationally, it's getting better in the sense that there's increased recognition. There's attempts at in changing the law. I mean, some countries have changed their law, like Israel improved tremendously from sending almost everybody to sending almost nobody to China. Taiwan has actually moved very well in the right direction. There's a few other jurisdictions where you can point to and say, sure, there's been improvement, and others where there's attempts to improvement, but it's spotty, and eventually my own belief is, and we can see this happening, there is a movement to a comprehensive um, avoidance of complicity with what's happening in China. But in terms of China itself, I mean, that remains to be solved.
One thing that I found interesting is because organ harvesting was associated with Falun Gong practitioners for so many years, and kind of Falun Gong wasn't really taken seriously in a certain way as like a human rights problem by like the wider human rights community because it seemed so niche and hard to understand. Now with the Uyghur situation, like that's pretty much like the Uyghurs are kind of like the new Tibetans in the sense that in the 90s everybody was like, free Tibet and like knew about that. And, now you have even like the US government saying that what's happening is a genocide in Xinjiang. So it's kind of more well known. Do you think as the Uyghur population becomes, kind of like, as you said, they're kind of replacing Falun Gong in terms of being the victims of organ harvesting just because the Falun Gong numbers are dropping and the Uyghur numbers are going up? Do you think as the Uyghurs become victims of organ harvesting, that organ harvesting as a whole will become more well known about?
Possible. I mean, one of the problems with getting wide recognition of organ harvesting is it's not visible. And the records are not available. The Everything happens in a closed operating room. You've got perpetrators and victims, no witnesses. You get whistleblowers, but whistleblowers only provide anecdotal information. They don't provide you scope and statistics. The hospital records are not available. The government of China records are not available. There is, I believe, some freedom of access information law in China, but you can imagine how that works. And whereas, I mean, in terms of scope, you can take a satellite and take a picture of Xinjiang, and you can see the camps, but you can't see the organ harvesting in the camps. So that's a particular problem, and also the I mean, this was a problem, of course, with the Holocaust as well. I mean, we got the Nazi records, but it was very difficult to prosecute a lot of the perpetrators because the witnesses were all killed. You have a similar problem with forced labor. Some of the people can say I was in forced labor, but nobody can get up and say I was killed for my organs. So that is a continuing problem. I mean, you do get more visibility with the Uyghurs, partly because they're Muslim and everybody understands Islam, and the appreciation of what Falun Gong is not as widely known. It's also partly because it's geographically isolated, so you can see there's a real concentration, whereas the Falun Gong were dispersed; they were everywhere. The Falun Gong are also, I mean, they're not ethnically distinct. They're not linguistically distinct. They're not visually distinct. Whereas the Uyghurs are. So that makes it easier to pick up what's going on. But I mean, I've been involved with some of the Uyghur human rights advocacy, and there is a tendency, even within the Uyghur community, to gravitate towards the more obviously noticeable human rights violations, like torture, like forced labor, where or just arbitrary detention, where you could show it on TV, and it's a lot easier to communicate visually than forced organ harvesting, even though they know about it, because it's harder to explain. You can't get the visuals, and one of the things that I've been, in my involvement with the Uyghur community is to try to get them to focus on this organ harvesting, even though it may be a harder victimization to sell than some of the more obvious victimization.
We make a good point with that because a lot of public outrage is driven by what the media reports. In general, I think the media has done a good job at, as you say, talking about some of those more visually grabbing instances of persecution of Uyghurs. How do you feel the media has done covering organ harvesting in Falun Gong?
Well, I mean, the media is far from monolithic. I would consider you as part of the media, and you've done a great job.
Thank you.
I mean, one of the problems with when you're dealing with media is, you can get a story and then it disappears. The question is, if it's there one day, what happens the next? And part of the problem with this story is, even if you like, we can produce a report, and there was a lot of media about that report. That when we did our press conference in uh, 2006 with our initial report, I mean, you can look it up in YouTube, and it's got a huge number of hits. But we can't do that every day. I mean, we can't produce a report every day. And that's, I would say, a problem. I mean, I wouldn't blame the media for that. It's just the way the media functions. I mean, the news is always has to be something new. Okay, they're killing 10,000 or 20,000 or 100,000 people a year for their organs. And you produce a report on that, they write a story on it, and then you tell them the next day the same thing. They say, okay, what else is new? So I think that's part of the problem. But there is, of course, I mean, with the media, to a certain extent, they're interested in what their readership or viewership or listenership is interested in, and if people that they're communicating to don't care about what's happening in China because China is not where they are, and they don't know what Falun Gong is, and the media are going to react to that. And you do also get some media that are got business interests in China, or want access to China for other reasons. I mean, China will evict reporters if they don't like the way they're reporting it. And for some people, that matters to them, having access to China. So they'll curb or tailor the coverage in order to get access to China. And so there's all these problems with it.
No, you mentioned that there's an issue of a lot of people not caring what happens in China, and you brought that up earlier as well. Sort of on a personal note, because you've been doing this for 15 years, looking into organ harvesting, but you have no family in China, you don't have the business or any interest there. Like, why have you dedicated such an enormous chunk of your life to dealing with this issue?
Well, I would say, first of all, it's not the only human rights issue I've been involved in the last 15 years, and also I was involved in many human rights issues before that. I wouldn't say it's just the last 15 years I've been dealing with human rights. I've been dealing with human rights my whole professional career, and the reason I'm so involved in human rights is basically because the Holocaust. And I mean, again, with the Holocaust, I wasn't affected. None of my family was affected. Nobody I knew personally was affected, but I had kind of this realization from a very early age that if the Axis powers, rather than the Allied powers, had won World War II, neither I nor any other Jewish person would be alive today. And so I developed this kind of consciousness that it was important to do something about this, not that I could do anything about the Holocaust, but to try to learn, at least for myself, some lessons from the Holocaust and act in them. And one of them was bring perpetrators to justice. Another was to protect refugees. A third was to combat incitement to hatred. But a fourth was to act on human rights violations wherever they occur. Because I think that one of the reasons the Holocaust occurred was not just that the Nazis of Germany wanted to kill all the Jews, but people elsewhere didn't do that much about it. I feel that I mean, personally compelled to act as much as I can for human rights violations with which I have no personal contact. I think that the absence of personal contact isn't a reason for doing nothing. It's a reason for doing something, because what it does is it manifests the commonality, the universality of humanity by jumping across the linguistic, the cultural, the geographic, the religious divide. What that demonstrates is the unity of humanity and the universality of human rights.
So it basically goes back to what you said. Was it Solon? You said, the Greek philosopher, that
Solon, yes, that's right.
yeah, it goes back to what he said. It has to, like, even for you, it began because something was relatable to you.
Hmm.
And so at the end of the day, like, these things need to somehow become relatable to the majority of people in the world. Not that it's something far off that doesn't affect them. So how do, well, Solon asked it, like, what, 2,000-3,000 years ago? How do we do that?
Well, I mean, when you talk about killing innocents for their organs, I say to people, look, you can't wait for somebody coming to kill you for your organs before you start protesting, because by then it's going to be way too late. If you want to stop someone from killing you for your organs, start now and dealing with it when it's somewhere else. I mean, the coronavirus, which you started asking about, is to a certain extent a metaphor of the problems of human rights, because human rights violations spread, and we've seen it with organ harvesting. I mean, it started with the death penalty. It goes on to Falun Gong. Then it's the Uyghurs, and it's not going to end with the Uyghurs if we don't do anything about it. With the coronavirus, if we'd taken it seriously from the moment it surfaced, instead of, as the Chinese did, to repress it and for the rest of the world to ignore it, we wouldn't have this coronavirus problem. And so this is not a matter of somewhere else, somebody else, doesn't matter. This is a matter of preservation of humanity, period. And with these violations, it's not just others at risk, we're all at risk.
When you tell people that, are they receptive to it? Do they actually make meaningful change in how they go about their lives?
Well, obviously, it depends. I mean, there's a wide variety of humanity. Some are, some aren't. And as I said, in the battle against human rights violations, what you're dealing with is mitigation, not elimination. I mean, if you think that all you have to do is say the right thing and do the right thing and talk to enough people, and all human rights violations will end forever, I think you're going to be quickly disappointed and burned out and leave, which is what I see all too often. And I think you have to adjust yourself to the fact that progress is going to be mitigated, and that's the only way to keep going, I think.
Well, I think you phrased it really beautifully. That was very well said. And I guess the issue will be, like, there are people going to be watching this podcast. I hope that is a message that they hear, and it affects them in a way that makes them take action as well, while also not getting burned out, because, as you say, it's mitigation, not elimination.
Okay, good.
Well, we can always just make jokes about organ harvesting to, keep us lighthearted.
Editor, add in a cricket sound, maybe a tumbleweed. Well, thank you for joining us. I really admire that you've been keeping up the fight for human rights for your entire life. That's. I hope I have that kind of longevity.
Well, I hope for your sake you do too.
That no one comes for my organs. That's a funny organ harvesting joke, Matt. That's how you do it. All right. Well, always a pleasure having you on. Take care and keep up the good fight. I hope you get more awards for your work.
Well, and I hope you have some more interviews.
Definitely. All right. Take care.
Yes. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I guess that was hopeful in a way. The fight will never, ever, ever be done or won.
But we can mitigate it to some degree.
I feel like that was just like a very realistic way to look at, humanity.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like it's not a good like headline on a website to sell it to people.
Yeah. So what's a clickbaity way that we can talk about this?
What an ancient Greek philosopher knew about today.
What? Do you think that's going to get people to click on it?
Yeah,
I
like
think
kind of
you
a Nostradamus kind of.
Okay.
Ooh.
That
Do you even read ancient Greek philosophy, Shelley?
I mean, I know that Stoicism is pretty popular in a certain corner of the internet, but I
That's
don't know
true.
that like everybody's like, "Ooh, I want to know what ancient Greek philosophers said."
Good point. Well, anyways, I hope you were inspired by today's message. Yeah, he makes a good point. We have to do something. We have to have it, figure out a way to make it relatable to people, so it's not just something like, it doesn't affect me. Like even for David, like he had that connection with the Holocaust, and that kind of it's something that sparks it.
His entire career is like Godwin's law.
Was that the thing about the cat in a box?
You mean Schrodinger's cat?
Uh-huh.
No,
I saw that on Stargate.
No, it's that, eventually.
Oh my gosh, that cat was so cute, Schrodinger.
Yeah. And the alien didn't really understand why they put a cat in a box.
Yeah.
I've been watching Stargate for the first time. It's a joy. If you
I'm a
skip the bad
fan.
episodes.
Yeah. You got to skip the bad
I also
episodes.
recommend that for Star Trek as well. Skip the bad ones. And
Uh,
that's our message of hope.
Skip the bad episodes.
Skip the bad episodes. Let's put that on a t-shirt. Thanks for watching China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley John.
And I'm Matt Gnezda.
And don't forget to skip the bad episodes. Every episode of China Unscripted is good.
Just to be clear. Okay.